Hello. Today, we will take a look at one of the strangest aspects of the Middle Ages, not the legends of knights and battles, but the place where people sought a little bit of oblivion in their harsh lives. They drank weak beer instead of water, believed in the power of herbs and ointments, danced until they dropped in the squares, and tried to forget themselves for at least a moment. And in this search for pleasure, there was everything: absurdity, danger, and a desperate desire to escape reality. If stories like this help you relax and fall asleep more easily, like and subscribe, but only if you really like it. And it would be nice to know where you are listening from and how much time you have right now. The comments form a small map of our community, and it's always amazing to see how different corners of the world come together here under one story. So dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let's embark on a strange journey together to a place where medieval highs were sometimes sweeter than sleep and sometimes deadly. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights, monks, and peasants, but we rarely think about what they had in their medicine cabinets. And in the medicine cabinet of a medieval person were things that would make a modern toxicologist clutch their head in horror. Black henbane was one of the most popular plants of that era. In small doses, it was used as a medicine. It helped with toothache, relieved spasms, and even alleviated insomnia. But if you took too much, you would find yourself in another world. Chronicles describe hallucinations. People saw strange animals, talked to spirits, and sometimes began to behave as if they were possessed. Some peasants believed that henbane opened the gateway to the spirit world. For healers, it was a tool. For witches, it was the key to their magical practices. And for neighbors, it was a reason to cross themselves warily and keep holy water at hand. Mandrake. If you've seen Harry Potter at least once, you probably remember the scene with the plant that screams so loudly that it can make you lose consciousness. The idea wasn't pulled out of thin air. Mandrake is truly shrouded in legends. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that if you dug up a mandrake, it would scream, and anyone who heard it scream could die or go mad. Therefore, a cunning ritual was devised. The plant had to be tied to a dog, which would run away and pull out the root. If the dog died from the scream, then the legend was confirmed. Of course, in reality, mandrake does not scream, but its root is truly unusual. Its shape resembles a human figure. Sometimes it looked like a little man or even a child. Such roots were used to make amulets. They were worn as talismans, hidden in chests, and believed to bring wealth and good luck. But there was also a downside. In medical treatises, mandrake was used as a painkiller. It was added to mixtures for operations, and the person would fall into a semi-conscious state. However, doctors never knew whether the patient would wake up or not. Belladonna. The Latin name translates as beautiful woman, and for good reason. During the Renaissance, women actually used its juice to dilate their pupils and make their eyes look languid. Beautiful, perhaps. Dangerous, very. Belladonna contains atropine, a substance that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. In small doses, it was used as a painkiller. In large doses, it was used as, well, let's just say, a ticket to the afterlife. But there is a more piquant side to it. Belladonna was part of the famous witches' ointments. Its effect is strong visions, a feeling of flying, and out-of-body experiences. This is where the legend of witches flying on broomsticks comes from. Most likely, they didn't fly anywhere, But the sensation of flying was so vivid that the women themselves believed they were traveling through the air, and the inquisitors, hearing such confessions, happily added a check mark to the list of evidence of witchcraft. Imagine a medieval home medicine cabinet: belladonna for toothache, mandrake for insomnia, belladonna for beauty and ecstatic practices. Today, all this would look like a suicide kit, but in those days, there were simply no other options. Doctors and healers experimented. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they maimed. For peasants, it was magic. For monastery doctors, it was science. And for the church, it was a reason to suspect someone of heresy. Belladonna, mandrake, and henbane became true icons of medieval pharmacology and magic. They gave people the opportunity to look beyond the edge, but there was a price to pay. Some returned with new knowledge and experiences, others never returned. If henbane and belladonna could drive any peasant mad on their own, imagine what would happen if they were mixed together. This is how the legendary witches' ointments came into being, thick potions that remain a symbol of medieval magic to this day. The composition of these ointments was impressive. They included henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and sometimes even datura. In small doses, they could be medicine. In large doses, they could be poison. And in the right mixture, they became a ticket to another dimension. The most curious thing is that these ointments were not drunk, but applied to the skin. The chronicles mention that witches rubbed them on their bodies or even used more intimate methods. The reason is simple. The substances acted faster and more strongly through the mucous membranes. This is where the legend of witches flying on broomsticks originated. No, of course, they did not take off like superheroes from comic books, but under the influence of ointments, it seemed to them that their bodies became weightless, as if they were rising into the air. Many witches swore that they went to Sabbaths, saw spirits, and even the devil himself. For them, this experience was real after all. Their brains perceived the sensations as genuine. Such stories played right into the hands of the inquisitors. During interrogations, women confessed to flying to Sabbaths and participating in devilish feasts and dances. For the church, this was ironclad proof of witchcraft. No one knew about chemistry and pharmacology at the time, so hallucinations were taken literally. In reality, the ointments worked like powerful psychotropic drugs. Belladonna and henbane caused visions and a feeling of flying, while mandrake enhanced the effect. But there was also a downside. An overdose led to convulsions, memory loss, and even death. Many stories about witches who behaved strangely or suddenly fell ill may have been the result of an unsuccessful experiment with ointments, and the neighbors didn't need much evidence. Strange behavior meant witchcraft, and so the suspect was taken for questioning and then to the stake. The myth of witches flying did not originate from magic, but from a chemical experiment. For medieval society, it was a convenient explanation. It was easier to accuse a woman of making a deal with the devil than to admit that she had simply tripped out on local pharmaceuticals. Today, these legends have become part of folklore. We laugh at paintings of witches flying through the night sky on broomsticks, but behind them lies a real story about how people experimented with nature in an attempt to escape the mundane, at least for a while. And it was witch ointments that became the symbol of medieval psychedelia, alcohol and safe water. Today, we turn on the tap without hesitation and drink clean water, but in the Middle Ages, things were much more complicated. Water from wells and rivers was often contaminated. Drink it, and you could end up with dysentery or typhoid fever. Therefore, the safest drink was alcohol, not because people wanted to get drunk, but because the fermentation process killed bacteria. Wine, beer, or even low alcohol brews were much safer than the murky liquid from the nearest stream. So for a medieval person, a sip of beer was not a way to relax after work, but literally a matter of survival. Today, the phrase children's beer sounds absurd or like a joke, but in the Middle Ages it was completely normal. In Europe, from the early Middle Ages, beer was considered not just a drink, but in fact the main source of liquid. Ordinary water was often dirty and dangerous. It could easily be contaminated by animal waste, sewage ditches, or corpses after epidemics. Therefore, water was practically not drunk, but replaced with weak alcoholic beverages. This is how the so-called small beer, German, klein beer, came into being. Its strength usually did not exceed 1 to 2%, sometimes even less. It could be drunk by the liter without causing severe intoxication. This drink was given to children, adults, and even monks during fasting. A peasant's morning did not begin with coffee, as it does for us, but with a mug of weak beer, another mug at lunch, something stronger at dinner. For children, small beer. For adults, normal ale. And this was not perceived as a vice, but as part of a healthy diet. Moreover, beer served as a source of calories. It contained carbohydrates, some B vitamins, and protein. For poor peasants, whose diet was often limited to porridge and bread, beer was an important addition to their diet. Sometimes people drank several liters of this beverage a day, and this was considered normal. Imagine, in a 14th century village, it was easier to find a child with a mug of beer than with a mug of clean water. Of course, there were downsides. Even weak beer gradually affected health, and in large doses turned village festivals into noisy drinking binges. But in conditions where water could kill faster than alcohol, children's beer seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were not only places of prayer and spiritual practice, they became true centers of science and economy, bustling with life. And it was monks who played a huge role in the development of alcohol culture in Europe. Why monasteries? First, monks had the most important things: time and discipline. Unlike peasants, who were constantly struggling to grow crops, monks could systematically manage their farms, observe, record, and improve recipes. Second, they had written sources. Many monks knew Latin and had access to ancient treatises describing the basics of winemaking and brewing. They adapted and developed this knowledge. In addition, the church officially supported wine production as it was used in the sacrament of communion. Monasteries in southern Europe, especially in France and Italy, became centers of winemaking. It was there that the first vineyards were planted, many of which have survived to this day. In northern and central Europe, where grapes did not grow as well, monks focused on brewing beer. Here, too, they achieved remarkable results. They began adding hops to beer. Previously, it was often brewed without them, which made the drink more aromatic and, most importantly, longer lasting. The monks carefully monitored quality, kept records, and experimented with ingredients. In fact, they laid the foundations for European beer traditions. Some monastic orders, such as the Trappists, became famous for centuries, and to this day, the tradition of Trappist beer exists in Belgium. It is brewed only in monasteries, according to ancient recipes, under the strict control of monks. For monks, beer and wine were not only drinks, but also part of the economy. They sold the surplus, earned income, and fed pilgrims and the poor. Thus, alcohol became a source of nutrition, part of religious rituals, and even an important economic resource. It can be said that it was the monasteries that transformed beer and wine from simple folk drinks into cultural and economic phenomena. Medieval Europe was not limited to beer and ordinary wine. People had a whole range of drinks, from sweet mead to the first strong distillates. Each of them had its own specialization and symbolism. Mead, the drink of gods and warriors. Honey has been considered a sacred product since ancient times, and mead occupied a special place in medieval culture. It was brewed by the Slavs, Scandinavians, and even the Celts. In Scandinavia, mead was considered the food of the gods, a drink served in Valhalla to fallen warriors. For the Slavs, mead was a drink for holidays, weddings, and rituals. It was prepared in advance, stored in barrels, and the best varieties were aged for years. It was sweet, aromatic, and quite strong, especially if it was aged for a long time. It is not surprising that feasts with mead often turned into grand celebrations where song and fighting went hand in hand. Spiced wine, medieval mulled wine. In southern Europe, wine was more highly valued, but they also knew how to pimp it. Spiced wine was popular. It was heated, and cinnamon, cloves, ginger, black pepper, and honey were added to it. Such a drink was not only delicious, but also considered medicinal. A doctor of that time could prescribe hot wine with cinnamon to strengthen the stomach or for colds. It was the medieval equivalent of our mulled wine, warming, aromatic, with the effect of being both delicious and healthy. The first strong drinks, alchemy in action. By the end of the Middle Ages, the distillation of liquids, appeared in Europe. At first, it was used by alchemists to create essences and aromatic waters, but they quickly realized that wine could also be distilled. This is how the first strong drinks appeared, the prototypes of brandy, schnapps, and whiskey. They were used primarily as medicine. It was believed that strong alcohol cleanses the body, kills diseases, and prolongs life. No wonder it was called aqua vitae, water of life. Of course, over time, the water of life began to be used not only for medicinal purposes, but it was in the Middle Ages that its history began. Mead, spiced wine, and the first distillates show how diverse the alcoholic culture of the Middle Ages was. Each drink had its place: beer for everyday consumption, mead for holidays, spiced wine for the soul and health, distillates for experiments and special occasions. And in each of them, people found taste, joy, and their own special way to get high. In the Middle Ages, a tavern was not just a place to drink. It was the center of life in a town or village, a real social club for all classes, from simple craftsmen to merchants and even minor nobles. In an era when there were no newspapers, radio, or the internet, it was in the tavern that you could find out all the news: who had died, who had gotten married, what rumors were circulating about the king or the local feudal lord. All this was discussed over a mug of ale. The tavern was an information hub where news spread faster than in church. Many deals were made there. Merchants negotiated trade, mercenaries found new masters, and peasants settled disputes. The tavern served as a stock exchange, a court and a trading floor all at once. Of course, it was also a place of entertainment. People played dice and cards, listened to musicians, and laughed at jesters. But it was also here that fights broke out. Alcohol quickly turned business conversations into noisy brawls. It is interesting to note that social boundaries were blurred in taverns. A peasant could sit at the same table with a merchant, and a craftsman with a soldier, and although status did not disappear, everyone in the tavern was united by one goal: to drink and catch the mood, and all this over a mug of beer or a glass of wine. Alcohol in the Middle Ages was not just entertainment, it was part of culture, medicine, religion, and everyday life. People drank to survive, they drank to socialize, they drank to celebrate, and unlike herbs and poisonous ointments, alcohol was a much more accessible and relatively safe way to get high. Random trips and mass hysteria. In the Middle Ages, bread was the staple of the diet, but sometimes this familiar product turned into a real drug, and at the same time, a deadly poison. The culprit was ergot, a fungus that affects rye and other cereals. Grain infected with ergot looked different from normal grain. It became dark, elongated, almost black. But in times of poor harvests, peasants rarely sorted the grain. Hunger left them no choice. Everything was ground up and made into bread. And then the worst began. Ergot releases substances that affect the nervous system, very similar in effect to LSD. People who ate such bread experienced a whole range of effects: strong hallucinations, a feeling of heat, or conversely, icy cold, convulsions and spasms, a feeling that the body was burning from within. Sometimes this ended in fatal convulsions. Medieval chronicles referred to such cases as Saint Anthony's fire. The sick felt as if their limbs were burning, and their skin was covered with ulcers and gangrene. For the people of that time, it was a miracle or divine punishment. No one suspected that it was just a fungus in the bread that was to blame. There were also mild cases. Sometimes ergot did not cause death, but rather visions and states that we would today call trips. A person could see demons, saints, angels, and was convinced that they had entered the other world. In fact, ergot became an unwitting supplier of psychedelic experiences in the Middle Ages. The only problem was that no one chose this high voluntarily. It came straight from a piece of bread, a common everyday food, and if an individual peasant could see miracles after eating a piece of bread, imagine what happened when the entire village ate contaminated grain. The chronicles have preserved descriptions of horrific scenes. Dozens of people simultaneously began to complain of fire in their veins. They were thrown into heat and cold. They screamed that they saw demons or angels. Some ran down the street screaming, some convulsed, and some fell into madness. Such outbreaks resembled mass insanity. People believed that a curse had fallen on their village, that the devil had entered their bodies, or that God had sent punishment, and no one even thought to connect this with the bread on the table. Historians suggest that in some years entire regions of Europe could suffer from such epidemics, and the worst thing was that the peasants themselves continued to eat the contaminated bread because they simply had nothing else. To modern people, this sounds like a horror movie scenario, food that drives entire settlements mad, but for the Middle Ages it was reality. Local priests held prayer services, made sacrifices to saints, and rang bells in an attempt to drive away evil spirits. But the disease did not go away until the supply of spoiled grain ran out. And here we come to an even more mysterious phenomenon, the so-called dancing plagues, when mass madness turned into non-stop dancing. And if mass convulsions and visions seemed frightening, sometimes the effects of ergot or other stress factors manifested themselves even more strangely. People began to dance, not in the sense of cheerful dancing at a wedding, but in a literal frenzy. At first, one or two people would go out into the square and start moving to the beat of some internal melody. After a few hours, dozens, then hundreds would join them, and the whole crowd would dance until they dropped. The chronicles record a striking case in Strasbourg in 1518. A woman named Frau Trofaya went out into the street and began to dance. She could not stop. By the end of the week, several dozen people had joined her. A month later, there were hundreds. People danced for hours and days on end, falling from exhaustion but getting up again. Some died right there in the square. From heart attacks or dehydration. What was it? Contemporaries believed that the townspeople were seized by divine punishment or devilish obsession. Today, scientists have a few theories. Mass ergot poisoning, psychogenic hysteria caused by hunger and stress, or a mix of these factors. But the fact remains. Whole cities turned into crazy dance floors where only the mind could hear the music. For the inhabitants of the Middle Ages, it was a monster in the literal sense of the word. Dances that could not be stopped. For us, it is one of the most mystical examples of how chemistry, psychology, and religious fear can intertwine in a single spectacle. And of course, such stories could not help but influence the image of possession and accusations of witchcraft. After all, who else could force hundreds of people to dance to death, if not the devil and his servants? When entire villages or towns suddenly began dancing nonstop, neighbors and priests could not explain it by hunger or fatigue. For the medieval mind, the answer was obvious. Evil forces were at work. If a person was convulsing, seeing demons, or dancing to death, it meant that someone had bewitched them. And most often, the accusations fell on women who already stood out from the crowd, healers, herbalists, widows, or simply those who were not like everyone else. Inquisitors readily recorded such cases in their protocols. The testimonies mentioned witches who sent dances or witchcraft powders. In reality, the cause could have been ergot-tainted bread or mass psychic hysteria, but it was impossible to explain this in the 15th century. Thus, tragic outbreaks of disease and madness became a convenient excuse for new bonfires. People needed to find someone to blame, and a witch was the perfect target in the eyes of the crowd. She knows herbs. She didn't come to the funeral. She gave her neighbor a dirty look. As a result, the personal misfortune of an entire city was turned into a political and religious tool, and those who suffered from this were the ones who were least to blame. Accidental trips in the Middle Ages were far more terrifying than intentional ones. If a witch smeared herself with a potion, she knew what to expect, but a peasant who ate contaminated bread found himself in hell completely unexpectedly. Hallucinations, hysteria, dancing plagues, all this shows how fragile life was in that era, and how easily one small grain could turn an ordinary day into a nightmare. Eastern parallels. While people in Europe were experimenting with bleached beer, the East had its own tradition of seeking a high, hashish. It was made from cannabis resin in small doses and had a relaxing effect, while in large doses it caused hallucinations and a feeling of being out of body. It was already being used in Persia, Egypt, and the Levant in the Middle Ages. Hashish played a special role among the Sufis, the mystics of Islam. For them, it was not just entertainment, but a way to achieve an altered state of consciousness and get closer to God. Prayers, music, and smoke all helped them go beyond the ordinary. In the Middle Ages, hashish was not only part of the mystical practices of the Sufis, but also the source of the darkest and most exciting legends. One of them is connected with the mysterious Order of Assassins. This order operated in the Middle East in the 11th to 13th centuries and struck terror into the entire region. Europeans called them hashishin, meaning those who use hashish. It is from this word that our word assassin later originated. According to legend, the head of the order, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, used hashish to control his warriors. They were treated to a drink or smoking mixture, after which they fell into a trance. When the warriors came to, they were told that they had been to the gardens of paradise. Streams of milk and wine, beautiful girls, music, and fragrances. It was believed that this was a carefully staged performance. The warrior was put into a narcotic sleep, transported to a garden with luxurious treats and concubines, and then brought back to reality. He was told, "This was paradise, and you will return there forever if you complete the order's mission." This is how absolute loyalty was created. For such assassins, death on a mission was not the end, but the way back to the promised paradise. Of course, modern historians argue about how true these legends are. Many believe that stories about hashish and paradise gardens are more likely European propaganda designed to discredit enemies, but the very fact that the word hashish has become firmly associated with the name of the order speaks volumes. In the eyes of medieval Europe, the assassins became a symbol of fanatics willing to go on any mission for the sake of a high and the promise of paradise. And it was this legend that reinforced the image of the East as a place of dangerous pleasures and dark magic. After stories about assassins and rumors of paradise gardens, attitudes toward hashish in the East became ambivalent. On the one hand, for Sufi mystics, it was a tool for spiritual exploration. On the other hand, in the eyes of rulers and theologians, hashish became a symbol of debauchery and a threat to order. Muslim scholars increasingly declared it sinful. As early as the 13th century, the first decrees prohibiting the production and use of hashish appeared. The rulers of Egypt and Syria issued harsh orders. Smoking houses were to be closed and violators punished. Sometimes they even burned entire fields of hemp to eradicate the devil's potion. But, as is often the case, prohibitions only fueled interest. People continued to gather in secret places to get high, in company, listen to music, and share stories. It can be said that it was during this period that the first underground clubs of hashish lovers were born. And so, we have an interesting paradox. Officially, hashish was considered shameful and sinful, but in practice, its use spread even more widely. It became part of urban culture in the Middle East, and in some places, even a kind of symbol of freedom from strict religious rules. So while in Europe, the church suspected witches of using herbs, in the East, the religious authorities fought against hashish, and in both cases, the result was the same. The more it was banned, the more people were drawn to the forbidden high. But hashish was far from the only way to achieve an altered state. In the East, there was another amazing product that did not need to be grown or banned. It was produced by ordinary bees. We are talking about so-called mad honey. In the Black Sea region, especially in the mountains of Asia Minor, bees collected nectar from rhododendrons. At first glance, these are ordinary flowers, but their nectar contains special toxic substances called granotoxins. They get into the honey and turn the sweet treat into a psychoactive potion. People who tasted such honey experienced unusual effects: dizziness and weakness, sweating and nausea, hallucinations, and a trance-like state. In small doses, it was like mild intoxication or euphoria, but if you overdid it, you would experience severe pain, a drop in blood pressure, and loss of consciousness. Sometimes it ended in death. Unlike hashish, which had to be specially prepared and consumed, mad honey could end up on the table by accident. Someone would bring a pot from a neighboring village, and suddenly the feast would turn into a nightmare. Nevertheless, this product had a sacred connotation for the locals. It could be used as a medicine or as a means for special rituals. The sweetness that carried poison seemed mystical and mysterious. So, while in 6.3 we saw how the authorities tried to combat hashish, it was pointless to fight mad honey. It was a gift of nature, and there was only one thing left to do: hope that the bees would not collect too much sweet poison that year. And while for ordinary people, mad honey was an unexpected surprise on the table, for warriors it could become a real weapon. Sources from antiquity and the Middle Ages have preserved descriptions of how sweet poison was used in military stratagems. The most famous case occurred as early as the 4th century BC. When Xenophon's army was passing through Asia Minor, the soldiers found pots of honey. They happily ate the treat and soon lost consciousness. The warriors writhed in nausea and hallucinations, lost their bearings, and fell to the ground. It was at this moment that the local tribes attacked the Greeks and easily defeated their weakened opponents. Later, Strabo, an ancient Greek historian, wrote about similar stories. He also noted that honey from these places could cause madness and the fall of warriors. The idea was simple. The enemy poisons itself, thinking it is finding a treat. Unlike a sword or arrow, such a weapon worked slowly but surely. Imagine, soldiers go into battle, but instead of holding shields and spears, they lie on the ground and see hallucinations. That is why mad honey was considered not just a strange product, but a real strategic trap. Thus, what was an accidental misfortune at a feast for some became part of military tactics for others, and sweetness with poison went down in history not only as a curiosity, but also as a real weapon on the battlefield. For local residents, mad honey was a double-edged product. A little bit, and you have a fun evening. A little more, and hello, painful death. This is very similar to European stories about belladonna and henbane. People tried and experimented without knowing the exact doses, and each time it was a risk, either pleasure or punishment. Eastern traditions of intoxication were in no way inferior to European ones. Hashish gave mystics a sense of unity with God, and assassins heavenly visions. Mad honey turned sweetness into a deadly weapon. All these practices show that the thirst for altered consciousness knew no bounds. Whether in Europe or the East, people sought ways to transcend reality, sometimes through faith, sometimes through excitement, and sometimes with weapons in their hands. Religious high medieval churches were places where people sought not only salvation for their souls, but also a special state of consciousness. Incense and myrrh, fragrant resins that emitted thick, sticky smoke, when burned, were used in every service. For parishioners, this was not just a pleasant fragrance. In poorly ventilated churches, the smoke enveloped the entire room, and people inhaled it for hours. Many began to feel slightly dizzy, foggy-headed, and detached from reality. In fact, incense became a mild psychoactive tool. When thick incense smoke enveloped the temple, it did not act alone. It was combined with everything that surrounded medieval parishioners during the service. Stained glass windows let multicolored light shine through, turning the interior into a play of lights. Hundreds of candles flickered, creating a special atmosphere of twilight. All this was accompanied by the sound of the choir and rhythmic prayers in Latin, which were repeated over and over again. This combination affected all the senses at once. The eyes caught the play of light and fire. The ears heard the rhythm of the chants. The nose smelled the thick aroma of incense. The body felt the crowd's closeness and the vibration of the sounds. For the believer, it became a kind of sensory overload. The consciousness was immersed in a special state. The outside world disappeared. Only the ritual remained. It is not surprising that many people described mystical experiences. Some saw a glow, some felt the touch of angels, some cried from overwhelming emotions. In essence, the religious rites of the Middle Ages were a carefully orchestrated theater of ecstasy. Even without poisonous herbs or alcohol, they immersed people in an altered state of consciousness. With the help of sound, light, smell, and repetitive movements, if ordinary parishioners felt slightly dizzy from the incense and hymns, imagine what happened to those who lived in monasteries for decades. Surrounded by these rituals every day, monks and mystics of the Middle Ages left behind amazing descriptions of states that we would today call ecstasy or trance. They spoke of the radiance they saw before their eyes, of heavenly voices that sounded in the silence, of a feeling of complete detachment from the body. Some claimed that they literally hovered above the ground during prayer. For the Church, such phenomena were perceived as a sign of divine grace. The chronicles tell how Saint Teresa of Avila fell into mystical ecstasy, describing it with the words, "God pierces my heart with fire." Saint Francis of Assisi said that he saw visions and heard angels while in a state of prayerful concentration. Today, psychologists and neuroscientists explain these experiences much more simply. Prolonged fasting, exhausting prayers, sleep deprivation, and sensory overload created altered states of consciousness. The brain reacted to stress and fatigue with hallucinations, which the monks themselves perceived as revelations. And yet, for the participants themselves, these experiences were absolutely real. They considered them encounters with God, confirmation of holiness, and proof that their lives were pleasing to heaven. In fact, monasteries became a kind of laboratory of ecstasy. An ordinary peasant could experience a mystical feeling only at a festival or in a temple, but a monk lived in an atmosphere where ecstasy became part of everyday life. While monks and saints achieved ecstasy through prayer, fasting, and long hours in the temple, there were also those who sought union with God through pain. These were the flagellants, groups of believers who believed that the only way to purify the soul was through self-flagellation. They took to the streets, gathered in processions, and publicly whipped themselves with rods until they bled. Crowds of people followed them, some joining in, others simply watching in horror. But for the participants themselves, this was not an act of madness, but a deeply religious ritual. The pain they inflicted on themselves pushed their bodies to the limit, and as soon as the body began to release endorphins, the flagellants felt a strange combination of suffering and euphoria. It was this feeling that they considered a sign of God's presence. The Chronicles describe scenes where people fell into a trance right during the flagellation. Some began to cry, some fell to the ground, some saw visions and claimed that angels appeared to them at that moment. For medieval society, such practices seemed both frightening and sacred at the same time. On the one hand, there was blood and pain. On the other, there was the belief that this was the way to atone for sins and feel God. As a result, flagellant processions became part of the religious landscape of the Middle Ages. It was collective ecstasy, achieved not through music and prayer, but through whips and blood. If for flagellants, ecstasy was born in pain and blood, then for the ordinary parishioner, the church was another path to an altered state. It can be said that in the Middle Ages, the temple played the same role that a club or concert does for us today. Instead of loud music, there was a choir and an organ. Instead of light shows, there were flickering candles and colorful stained glass windows. Instead of thick smoke from the dance floor, there were clouds of incense, and most importantly, there was a sense of community. Hundreds of people sang, prayed, and moved together in unison. This unity created a special atmosphere where people felt part of something huge and significant. The usual everyday life, with its hunger and disease, remained outside the doors, and inside the temple, there was a ritual in which everyone was equal before God. For peasants, going to church was not only a duty, but also a way to experience a special emotional uplift. These services could truly replace theater, music, and nightlife for people. In essence, religious rituals were the medieval equivalent of a mass trance event, where rhythm, light, and smoke created a state close to collective ecstasy. Religious practices in the Middle Ages were not only spiritual, but also physiological. Incense, songs, fasting, pain, all of these altered the perception of reality, and although priests never referred to it as a high, that was precisely the result. Thus, religion became one of the main technologies of altered consciousness in the Middle Ages. Underground pharmacists. But outside the temples, far from stained glass windows and choirs, people had another source of miracles: village healers and herbalists. At a time when there were almost no doctors with diplomas, and the services of medical scientists were available only to the rich, it was these people who were the main healers for the common people. Every village knew at least one such person. Most often, it was an elderly woman, a grandmother healer. She knew which herbs helped with fever, which relieved toothache, and which put the patient to sleep. Her experience was passed down from generation to generation, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly. For peasants, she was a real walking pharmacy. Instead of pills, she used dried roots. Instead of antibiotics, she used decoctions and tinctures, and, interestingly, many of these remedies really worked. But there was also a danger here. The same herbs that relieved pain could cause hallucinations or led to death if the dosage was wrong. The healer operated on the edge, between treatment and poisoning. It is not surprising that such people were treated with both respect and caution. Some saw them as saviors, others as intermediaries between the world of humans and the spirits, and the church often viewed them with suspicion. It was all too easy to attribute any knowledge of herbs to witchcraft. Nevertheless, it would have been impossible to survive without healers. They delivered babies, treated wounds, relieved pain, and did what no one else could do. And if religion gave peasants spiritual ecstasy, healers gave them a chance to live at least one more day in the harsh medieval world. If we were to look inside the medieval medicine cabinet of such a healer, we would find an amazing collection. Dried henbane for pain relief, mandrake root for sleep and protection from evil spirits, poppy heads as a sedative and painkiller, wine infused with herbs, a universal remedy for everything. In the right dose, it helped. In the wrong dose, it turned a person into a possessed one. If we look inside a village witch's medicine chest, we will see a whole arsenal of useful and dangerous herbs. For peasants, such knowledge was a real lifesaver. Imagine a child has a fever and there are no doctors or medicines in the area. They go to the healer, she gives them poppy tincture, and the child falls asleep and their temperature drops. Someone has a toothache, and she recommends a decoction of bleached herbs. Someone suffers from insomnia and is given mandrake root. To ordinary people, this seemed like a miracle. That is why the village respected and even feared the healer. She could heal, but she could also cast a spell. But to the church, all this seemed much more alarming. Any use of herbs, especially those that cause strange states, was automatically associated with witchcraft. In the eyes of the priest, the healer was not a helper, but a rival. After all, she could heal without prayers and icons. The chronicles often contain complaints from clergymen that the people were going to the herbalist instead of the church. For the church, this was a direct challenge to its authority. Thus, a paradox arose. In the eyes of the people, the herbalist was a savior, but in the eyes of the church, she was a witch and a servant of the devil. It was this duality that often determined the fate of such women. If she helped, she was revered. If something went wrong, the neighbors immediately whispered, "She must be to blame." Chronicles and records from the late Middle Ages have preserved dozens of recipes used by midwives and herbalists. Some sound almost like recipes. Wine mixed with honey and poppy seeds, ointment made from lard and bleached flour. Some helped with pain, others induced sleep, and still others caused hallucinations. Today, pharmacologists can explain the effects of most of these mixtures, but back then, they were perceived as magic. Underground pharmacists were the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. They helped people survive, eased suffering, and gave hope. But it was their knowledge and experiments that caused fear and accusations. For some, they were saviors. For others, they were witches and servants of the devil. And this duality became permanently entrenched in culture. A healer could be either a wise old woman or an enemy of the human race, society, and perception. For the average peasant in the Middle Ages, altered states of consciousness were part of everyday life. Alcohol replaced water, herbs were used as medicine, and sometimes as a remedy for melancholy. If a neighbor started singing songs or telling stories about encounters with spirits after a mug of beer, it was considered normal. No one thought about drugs in the modern sense. Everything was part of everyday life: bread, wine, herbal decoctions. While peasants were content with a mug of beer and herbal tea, the nobility enjoyed a completely different kind of high, where ordinary people used what was available and sometimes even random ingredients, the aristocracy could afford true abundance. The feast of the nobility resembled theatrical productions. Exotic dishes and drinks brought from overseas countries appeared on the tables. Expensive wines from southern Europe, oriental spices, rare sweets. The mere appearance of such delicacies demonstrated the status and wealth of the host. Here, the high was not only in intoxication, but also in the very demonstration of luxury. Wine with spices, mead with honey from the best apiaries, overseas tinctures. All of this was an indicator of prestige. In addition, the nobility loved experiments. Alchemists and court physicians prepared all kinds of potions for the aristocrats, tinctures for male strength, love aphrodisiacs, mixtures for longevity. These remedies did not always work, and sometimes they even crippled the body. But among the nobility, even risky experiments were perceived as fashionable fun. Thus, for the common peasant, getting high was a way to escape from harsh reality, while for the aristocrat, it was an opportunity to emphasize his power and wealth. In one case, it was bread and beer; in the other, expensive wines and alchemical elixirs. If the nobility could afford to feast for pleasure, then the church should have set the opposite example: asceticism, humility, and strict moderation. But in reality, everything turned out to be much more complicated. Officially, priests condemned drunkenness and debauched entertainment. Sermons were preached from the pulpit that excessive consumption of wine was a sin, and that revelry in taverns led to the destruction of the soul. However, the monasteries themselves were the largest producers of alcohol in Europe. Monks brewed beer, made wine, and perfected recipes. As a result, their products fed entire regions, and the meals of bishops and abbots often differed little from the feast of the nobility. There were expensive wines, spices, and exquisite dishes. In fact, the clergy lived by the same rules as the aristocracy, only under the guise of theology. The situation with ecstasy and altered states is even more interesting. When a monk saw visions or fell into a trance, it was considered a gift from God. But if the same thing happened to a peasant woman, it was interpreted as possession and a reason for interrogation. This is how double standards arose. What was a status symbol for the nobility and a sign of holiness for monks became an accusation of heresy or witchcraft for ordinary people. That is why the church simultaneously enjoyed the fruits of ecstasy and fought against it when it went beyond its control. And here, the church's most glaring double standards turned into a terrible practice. If visions brought glory and an aura of holiness to a monk, then the same symptoms threatened a peasant or peasant woman with trial and burning at the stake. Any strange behavior could be grounds for accusation. Someone talking to themselves, that meant they were hearing the devil's voices. Someone seeing vivid dreams or hallucinations after drinking herbal tea, that meant witchcraft. Someone dancing too merrily at a village festival, that meant suspicion of alliance with evil forces. The inquisitors eagerly collected such evidence. And here, the herbs, ointments, and alcohol we talked about earlier played a fateful role. Their effects were easily turned into arguments against a person. During interrogations, confessions such as, "I rubbed ointment on my body," "I flew to a Sabbath," and "I spoke with spirits," were often heard. In reality, these were either hallucinations under the influence of henbane and belladonna, or words extracted under torture, but this was enough for the court. The inquisitorial trials turned into a theater of fear. People were forced to confess to things they did not do, and the audience was shown how the church was fighting heresy. Moreover, the poorer and more defenseless a person was, the more likely they were to become a victim. Thus, the high, in the eyes of the church, became not a personal experience, but evidence, and thousands of people paid with their lives simply because their bodies once reacted to weed or mushrooms in a way that no one could explain at the time. The trials of the Inquisition clearly demonstrated the main contradiction of the Middle Ages. What brought glory to one person as a saint led another to the stake. If a monk had visions and claimed to have spoken with angels, it was considered a miracle, a sign of God's mercy. If a peasant woman said the same thing after drinking a potion made from henbane, it was considered a pact with the devil. If an aristocrat lost his sense of moderation at a lavish feast due to wine and exotic liqueurs, it was simply human weakness. But if a peasant got drunk in a tavern and started dancing or raving, his actions were seen as witchcraft. This line was blurry and depended not on the phenomenon itself, but on who was involved. Status, class, and proximity to the church determined whether your vision would be recognized as a miracle or a curse. That is why, in the Chronicles, we see stories of great mystical revelations and possessed witches at the same time. Although, perhaps, the mechanisms were the same. For some, it was a path to sainthood. For others, it was a death sentence. Thus, the Middle Ages turned out to be an era where any unusual state of consciousness balanced on a fine line between a heavenly miracle and a deadly accusation of witchcraft. Medieval society was constantly searching for explanations. For peasants, high was an everyday occurrence. For the nobility, it was a status symbol. For the church, it was either grace or heresy. It was precisely this duality that gave rise to legends about witches, miracles, and the possessed. Everything depended not on the state itself, but on who interpreted it and how. We have come a long way through the Middle Ages and seen that people back then sought altered states just as we do today. Alcohol, herbs, ointments, religious rituals, even accidental poisoning. All of these were attempts to escape the confines of ordinary reality. People have always wanted more than just food and work. They sought escape in a beer mug, in mandrake, in incense smoke, or in songs in the square. The main difference between that era and today is that people did not have the scientific knowledge to explain what was happening. Today, we know that ergot contains ergotamine and belladonna contains atropine, but back then, these were miracles, witchcraft, or divine punishment. Every experience was a blind experiment. A sip of wine could save you from infection, while herbal ointment could send you to the stake. The irony is that not much has changed since then. Yes, we have medicine, filtered water, laws, and pharmaceuticals, but people's desire to get high remains the same. Today it's music, sports, travel, virtual reality, or, for some, the same substances. And just as in the Middle Ages, society argues about where the line is between what is permissible and what is forbidden, between spiritual experience and dangerous experimentation. Medieval man sought pleasure in herbs, wine, faith, and dancing. We seek it in other forms, but the essence remains the same. History shows that the desire to go beyond reality is part of human nature, and perhaps it is precisely this that drives us forward, from village bonfires to space flights. So, the next time you raise a glass of wine or turn on your favorite music, remember, in a sense, you are continuing a centuries old tradition